Hello there, you're now watching TVS News at 5. I'm Hari Zainuddin, your anchor for today. Now let's begin with our top story for today. Brunei intends to completely reopen its land and sea borders on August 1st. This decision, however, highly depends on the outcome of the COVID-19 situation in the country and regionally, as well as the operational preparedness of its border control stations.
According to a statement published on the Prime Minister's Office PMO website yesterday, beginning 15 June 2022, cross-border travel through land and seaports will be permitted only for essential travel. Among the listed reasons are for the purpose of work or school, which is also extended to commute travels for the aforementioned purposes, transit travels and local or foreign registered transport operators for the purpose of essential import and export supply deliveries. The statement also reiterated that applications for essential travel must be submitted through its website. It added that starting June 15th, pre-departure swab tests for inbound travelers are no longer required regardless of vaccination status. However, travelers who have not completed their COVID-19 vaccination need to undergo the ART testing upon arrival, followed by a 3-day self-isolation, and will only be allowed to end their isolation upon a negative ART test on day 3. According to Brunei's COVID-19 Steering Committee, foreigners and citizens who seek to enter or depart the country must have a minimum COVID-19 travel insurance coverage of 20,000 Brunei dollars for air, land, or sea travel.
Now, the government has agreed to abolish the mandatory death penalty and to substitute it with other sentences which are subject to the discretion of the court. The decision was reached after a report was presented on the substitute sentences for the mandatory death penalty at the Cabinet meeting last Wednesday, June 8th.
Minister in the Prime Minister's Department for Parliament and Law, Dato Sri Dr. Wan Junaidi Tuanku Jaafar said the government has also agreed in principle to accept and take note of the recommendations made by the Special Committee on Substitute Sentences for the Mandatory Death Penalty as explained in the report. The study would be carried out in collaboration with the Attorney General's Chambers, the Legal Affairs Division of the Prime Minister's Department, and other relevant ministries and departments. Wan Junaidi said this was to ensure that all amendments to the relevant laws would take into account the principles of proportionality and constitutionality of any proposal made to the government later. In addition, the government will also carry out a feasibility study on the direction of the criminal justice system in the country, such as having pre-sentencing procedures, a sentencing council, and a sentencing guideline. Also to be studied is the setting up of a law commission, prison reform, and the execution of sentences based on restorative justice.
Betong Division's numerous tourism potentials are simply waiting to be explored. Deputy Premier of Sarawak, Dato Amar Douglas Ugah Embas said the time had now come for these potentials to be properly identified, developed and promoted.
The Deputy Premier singled out Bukit Sadok, the site of the fortress of Iban legendary hero and Sarawak nationalist Rentap, as one of its potential. Commenting further, Ugah said the state government had recently approved a sum of 15.9 million ringgit to build a replica of Rentap's fortress together with other facilities in Bukit Sadok. On other potential products, he said these included a number of traditional longhouses, the Iban colorful culture, and traditions. These includes jungle trekking and fish conservation programs, or locally known as the Tagang system, as well as the Malay Kampong in Spao, which offers various homestay programs. He added that an airport was also being built at Babuling in Spao for other freight and passenger services. Ugah expressed his hope that the Sarawak Tourism Board could lend a helping hand in identifying and giving proposals on how best to develop and promote these potentials.
Welcome back to News on 5. Now, still on the abolishment of the death penalty, Sarakan lawyer Shankaram Asnani welcomes the government's announcement on abolishing the mandatory death penalty. Speaking to TVS, he described the decision as a progressive move, as he contended there is no credible evidence that the death penalty deters crime more efficiently.
Shankar said, however, the judges must have the discretion to sentence offenders based on the facts of each case so as to ensure that justice was served.
But of course, there are certain cases where, the discretion of the judge ought to be retained, where a crime of sheer cruelty and brutality, then the death sentence must be maintained. But however, like in drug cases, there are a lot of drug mules, people who are just mere transporters, and they face the death penalty. This is really very...
Commenting further, Shankar said that the legal system in Malaysia should be in line with many progressive countries so that certain laws can be amended.
That is very, very important, because a lot of our laws are archaic, and we've got to move, expeditiously and in consonance with the international arena where laws are amended and all that very fast, you see. Unlike in our place here, there are a lot of things that are lacking behind. So we got to improve. We got to be very competitive also, like any other countries in the world that is progressing very well.
Earlier today, Law Minister Wan Junaidi Tuanku Jaafar said Putrajaya had agreed to abolish the mandatory death penalty, giving judges discretion in sentencing. The cabinet had also agreed for a further study to be carried out on the proposed substitute sentences for 11 offences carrying the mandatory death penalty, one of which under Section 39B of the Dangerous Drugs Act 1952. Previously, lawyers and interest groups had called for a moratorium on the execution of death row inmates until Parliament voted on a bill seeking the abolition of the death penalty. It is reported that a total of 1,359 people are on death row sentence as of November last year.
Now, Malaysia's palm oil inventories shrank at the end of May as exports surged to a 5-month peak, when rival Indonesia halted shipments, although production fell less than expected. Data from the Malaysian Palm Oil Board, MPOB, showed that the stockpile at the world's second-largest producer dropped 7.37% from April to 1.52 million tons.
However, production, which had risen in the past 2 months, slipped 0.07% to 1.46 million tons. Meanwhile, imports fell 33.9%. Exports jumped 26.67% to 1.36 million tons, the highest since December. Traders turned to Malaysian palm oil after top producer Indonesia imposed an export ban that lasted 3 weeks. Nevertheless, the strong export pace is unlikely to maintain in June, as Indonesia has since switched stance and is now gearing up to accelerate exports of at least 1 million tons of the edible oil. Indonesia is making various changes to its export rules to encourage overseas shipments, including reducing overall export tax and levy. The resumption of Indonesian supplies will put a cap on Malaysia's exports from the second half of June onwards, making production figures the key to price action.
Despite rising global crude oil prices, the government has assured that there is still sufficient funds for fuel subsidy. The people's welfare remains the government's top priority, said Finance Minister Tengku Datuk Sri Zafrul Tengku Abdul Aziz.
During the launching of the Khazanah Sustainability Framework and Targets, Tengku Zafrul stated that this year's inflation target is still within what was originally planned, which is between 2.3 and 3.3%. As such, continuous monitoring will be carried out to keep track of the global oil prices. Earlier, the government has announced that the amount of the subsidies for this year will reach 70 billion ringgit, which means the fuel subsidy will reach 30 billion ringgit. The projection was made based on the Brent oil price. Meanwhile, He reiterated that at present, the government has no intention of asking for additional dividends from Petronas to bear the subsidy. As such, he added that the government's revenue has also increased, although the increase is not as high as the increase in subsidy.
Now wrapping up news at 5, a gunman opened fire on his co-workers at a manufacturing facility in northern Maryland on Thursday, June 9, killing at least 3 people and critically wounding a 4th before being taken into custody after a shootout with the police. The 23-year-old assailant, who was not been identified by police, was wounded in an exchange of gunfire with Maryland State Trooper while trying to flee in a car. The shooter used a semi-automatic pistol handgun.
Washington County Sheriff Douglas Mullendorf said both the suspect and trooper were taken to a local hospital for treatment of gunshot wounds in the latest in a series of mass shootings to plague the United States. Mullendorf declined to elaborate on the circumstances or possible motives behind the attack, but said the gunman and all his victims were employees of Columbia Machine in Smithsburg in northern Maryland.
And that is all the time that we have for TVS News at 5. Now stay up to date with the top stories via our website at TVSTVMY and follow our social media platforms for the latest news and entertainment. Once again, I'm Hari Zainuddin. It's been a pleasure.